Welcome to Dyscastia, a podcast for parents and teachers about the best way to support kids living with learning difficulties. My name's Michael Shanahan, and I'm casting to you today from the lands of the Kaurna people. Today we are talking about mental health and learning difficulties, and I'm joined again by Valli Jones. Valli, welcome back. I had you on the podcast a few months ago now.
Thank you, Michael. It's so lovely to be here with you again.
Mental health is such a huge part of a kid's life, particularly kids living with learning difficulties, because things are often, not always, they don't have to be, but they are often harder for kids living with learning difficulties. And
Absolutely.
I'm not sure about your experience, but my experience is that they almost go hand in hand, mental health issues and kids living with learning difficulties. And so I thought it would be really useful to get your kind of unique insight into the kind of mental health issues that you see on a day-to-day basis in your practice. To make sense of that, perhaps if you introduce yourself and tell us what it is you do. And then what we're going to look at is your kind of top 5 most common issues that you deal with kids.
Yeah, absolutely. So my name's Valli. I'm a clinical psychologist. I work in private practice with children, young people and their families. And yeah, a lot of the young people that I see have learning disorders, either as the primary sort of part of their presentation or as just one piece of the puzzle of all that's going on for them. So it's definitely something I have a lot of empathy for the kids and families and teachers who are supporting the kids with learning difficulties. And you're right, mental health challenges go alongside.
Mm. And there is a role for everyone, isn't there? You know, if a kid's living with mental health issues, it's often just as big an issue for the parents and the school and all the people around them who care for them so much. And it's very painful to see someone you care for and someone you love going through that kind of difficulty. And so I think part of why I wanted to talk about these kind of top 5, I mean, I know that's kind of an odd way to put it, but I wanted to talk about it because I think as a parent myself, I did feel a level of isolation. You know, you're a parent of kids living with learning difficulties. It can be all-consuming. And your life is kind of work and school and dealing with meltdowns and dealing with difficulties. Sometimes it feels like there's not much space for anything else, and you can feel very isolated. And I kind of thought, talking to you about the kind of top issues that you see might help people feel a little less isolated, to know that this is not just something that's happening to them or happening to you. This is something a lot of people experience, and you're in a unique position in that you see lots of people in similar circumstances. And so I thought you might be able to give us some kind of helicopter view perspective of the kind of difficulties you see and the most effective, I know we can't generalise, but, you know, generally the most effective approaches to supporting kids that are going through difficult times, because kids also, you know, parents and families also don't often have access to professional support like you provide, and sometimes they've got to work it out for themselves. So if we can give some kind of strategies and things that people can do, I think that would be really helpful as well.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So I think the top 5, I had to think about this when you, before we started talking today. And I guess something that is, you know, potentially reassuring, not comforting, but, you know, you're not alone if you're a parent with a child with anxiety. It's statistically 1 in 4 kids have anxiety there or thereabouts. And that rate has been increasing steadily. And so, you know, in a classroom of 20 kids, there'll be 5 kids that have got some form of anxiety, and that will vary for some kids. So anxiety tends to vary in its presentation across childhood and adolescence. So things manifest in a way that's sort of developmentally appropriate. So in very young kids, we'll see separation anxiety. In slightly older kids, it's fear of spiders and monsters and the dark. And, then kids will get to a point where they'll start, they'll realize that, we're mortal and maybe mum or dad might die at some point. And then, that the next stage of anxiety might be social anxiety. What do people think of me? Do they like me? Do I, are my friends really my friends? And that, that really peaks in adolescence when kids developmentally sort of pull away from the family and move towards their peer group. And, from an evolutionary perspective, it makes sense because they really want to connect with their peer group and be accepted. And so that social anxiety is, there's a lot of self-monitoring and a lot of second guessing, and it's hard as a parent watching your child go through any of those things. And, certainly when kids are young and you've got a child with separation anxiety and the drop-offs are, emotional, and, you leave your child at kindy or at school and they're crying and then you're crying in the car on the way to work. It does consume your life to some extent when you've got a child with significant anxiety.
Is that the number one on your list? Anxiety?
Yeah, it is. I think, often what people will present with is they'll say, oh, my child's really emotional and they're acting out. But when we dig down, what's underneath that is anxiety, but that it might not be as clean cut as the anxiety that I've described. So it'll be one of those two things. Yeah. And that's usually the surface sort of presentation, and then we look beneath that to find out, okay, well, why, what's going on? And sometimes it'll be because there are parents with anxiety, and we know that the etiology of anxiety is complex and varied, and when you've got a parent with anxiety, there's that sort of hereditary contribution, but also kids are being raised in an environment where parents might be hypervigilant, or they might be more cautious than someone who doesn't have anxiety, and so that social learning, kids pick up the message, it's unspoken often, but they pick up the message that the world is a scary and dangerous place. And then, they express that in the way that makes sense to them. Because it's so common, there are a lot of really good resources for parents just for, education, understanding what's happening, understanding the little things that they can do. And, that varies depending on the way the anxiety's presenting for the child. But certainly, having an understanding of the role of avoidance in anxiety is really helpful. And, that basically, we can sum that up by saying anxiety makes us want to avoid the thing that's making us anxious. Yep. And so in the short term, when we avoid the thing that's causing the anxiety, we feel better. But in the long term, the anxiety grows. It multiplies. And so avoidance is, for a lot of parents, their sort of immediate response, oh, my child's really scared of this, or there's a lot of anxiety around this, I won't make them do that. Yep. And intuitively, as a parent, it makes sense. Don't put your child in a situation that they're really uncomfortable or upset by. And there's a time and a place for that, absolutely, depending on what the situation is. But in cases where the thing that's making the child anxious is objectively safe, and we know that there's separation, those kind of things, that facilitating that avoidance isn't always helpful. You've got to parent your child in a way that aligns with your values, and so it's finding a way to balance what you feel you need to do as a parent with what is going to be ultimately most healing for the child, and give them a realistic sense of the level of danger in the situation. Yeah. Don't put your kids in a dangerous situation, but when it's a safe situation, avoidance often makes the situation worse.
How do we know? So let's say we've got a kid that's anxious, and let's choose something quite common. What's a common thing that a kid would be anxious about?
I guess the thing that people come to me for where it's really impacting their life is often school-related anxiety that, that manifests as sometimes just complete school can't or complete school avoidance. It often starts as separation anxiety, really tricky drop-offs. Yep. And then sort of.
Okay, so let's have a think about those tricky drop-offs. How do we know when forcing them to go is a good thing or a bad thing? Like, at what point do we say, well, they're a bit anxious, so let's, push them and say, well, you have to go, you've got no choice. But does there come a point where it actually kind of causes trauma to force them into that scary situation? And and
Yes.
builds the anxiety for next time. How do we juggle that kind of tricky balancing act?
Yeah. So it really does need to be done on a case by case basis. But the general sort of process that I recommend is for there to be really good communication between parent and teacher, and to have a transition process at the time of drop off so that the child is handed to someone who they have a safe relationship with, and there's some sort of predictability around those first 15 minutes of the day. And so it might be that you drop them a bit before the bell. For some kids that works well, and they go to a pub or some sort of calm space and do a transition activity, play a game, read a book, what have you, and then transition to class. For other kids, it's better to go straight, like for them to be going straight into the classroom and engaging in learning. That just works better for them. So it's a little bit of trial and error of finding what works for the child. And in the early days, assuming that we've checked what's happening and we understand that the child does have what they need at school, that there isn't something going on there that's causing the anxiety, whether it be bullying or, as you said, some sort of learning difficulty where they're walking into the classroom and feeling incompetent, and that's a scary feeling for anyone. And then everything that gets layered on top of that is harder to manage when they've got that core sense of, I'm being asked to do something that I just can't do. So, really understanding what's happening for them and what's underneath it. But for some kids, it is just that it's a transition and they're moving from a safe, comfortable, their warm and fuzzy space at home into a situation that's not that. And with the right support and that gentle nudge, which, that's what I had to do with my daughter. She was fine at school. I'd done all of the checks and made sure, but it was just that, I'd just rather stay with you. So, put her in the classroom, and then in prep, she'd turn around and run back out, and I'd turn her around and push her back into the classroom. Yeah. And it was a bit of a playful game, but at the end of the day, it was a case of, that's where you're staying today and I'm going to work. So
yeah,
if that initial sort of support and process doesn't resolve the issue, if you've got that consistent transition in place, and there might be a transition item as well for young kids, whether it's an item from mum or dad that they keep with them in the day, and then they know that mum or dad will come back at 3:00 and meet them at the pickup bay, or so there's real predictability around it, and they have some sense of being connected to mum and dad, and we know they're safe at school, and it continues. Then you do need to look more closely at what might be going on for that young person.
Sometimes that's difficult, isn't it? Because often kids don't know, or they find it difficult to say why they're scared. So how would you, like if you were working with a kid, how do you get to the bottom of that? How do you find out what the core issue might be? Or if I was a parent, how do I have those conversations with a child to work out what is the issue here? Why is this so stressful?
Some kids do better when there's a selection of, whether you use cards or pictures or things, so that they're not sort of having to pull the information from nowhere, but they're choosing from a selection of prompts. For some kids, that can be a way of facilitating that communication. As a psychologist, I always suggest, and I'm mindful that not everybody has access to a psychologist, but I always suggest, if things have persisted despite those sort of entry-level supports, to do a comprehensive diagnostic assessment. And when I do those, often there is something more going on that is not immediately apparent. So, and because I work with a lot of autistic kids and families, often it is autism, and it's something that's been not picked up before going to school. And then once they hit that sort of high demand, high social demand, high academic, cognitive demand, there's so many demands once you get to a prep classroom, kindergarten classroom, that's when you start to see the demands are exceeding their capacity. Whereas in an early childhood setting, not the case.
We've been talking about anxiety, and there's a whole bunch of different causes for anxiety, which brings us to number 2 on the list here of, it's basically anxiety leading to kind of emotional dysregulation, meltdowns, issues, not wanting to do those transitions. Sometimes maybe that expresses as anger or aggression,
Yeah.
and it's hard to get to the bottom of that.
Yeah.
So
And
are
and
they mostly driven by anxiety, do you think?
so often they are. There's typical and atypical anxiety. So typical anxiety is so the anxieties that I mentioned that often present in typically developing children, and we can identify that there's a worry that goes along with it. And so it might be
Mm.
with the worry is separating from mum, or the worry is going to school, or the worry is what have you. And we address those anxieties in one way. And then there's atypical anxiety, which is really common in autistic and other neurodivergent people. And it's more of that body-based anxiety that, whether it's things that are triggered by sensory aspects of the environment. There's, a sensitive sympathetic nervous system that flicks into fight, flight, freeze, or flop more easily. And it's often based on things that are quite benign and are not associated with a conscious thought. There's
Yeah.
not it'll be, if you're not aware that you've got auditory sensitivities or you can't put words around that, but every time the school bell goes, your heart rate increases and you get that kind of jittery feeling.
Yeah.
That would be an example of atypical anxiety, and that's often, or both of them underlie that emotional dysregulation and behaviour for a lot of kids, and it's cumulative as well for the kids that have a few little things in the environment that just kind of trigger them and set them off, and then over the day it builds into something really significant, and then there's the straw that breaks the camel's back. Someone gives them a maths question and they've got dyscalculia and it's all
Yeah,
over, or
that's right.
or
And
yeah.
then that makes them more anxious about the next day. How do we
Yeah.
break that cycle? How do we
Oh,
bring calm to that storm?
yeah. I think having really understanding and kind adults is really important. What I tend to see is that the kids who act out behaviorally, so their anxiety manifests behaviorally, often get met with less compassion than children whose anxiety manifests as, withdrawal or that separation fears or things that you can more easily go, yeah, I get that kid's
Mm,
scared. That we tend as a collective to be far more accommodating and caring and nurturing towards those kids than we are the kids who, swipe everything off the desk and throw a chair across the room. And understandably,
mm,
but I think, what they need is someone who goes, yeah, I can see you're not okay. Come here. Let's just take a walk, take some breaths. What's going on? What can we do? You're not in trouble. It's, we just
mm,
we want to help, and that goes a long way, that co-regulation and that understanding of, okay, someone sees me for who I am and I'm not in trouble and I'm not going to be punished for something that's essentially out of their control.
mm.
Yeah.
It's really interesting that you say that, because I pictured then, you picture a typical drop off and you have an anxious kid, and I can picture, as you say, like a sympathetic response to that, where there's a lot of nurturing that happens. A teacher or someone or even a group of friends might come and say, you'll be okay. They pat them on the back, and it has that kind of warm, welcoming atmosphere, and everyone kind of tries to boost them up to get them to come into the school. But if a kid, by pure luck, this is just how their system works, rather than expressing that anxiety as, that typical kind of fight or, flight or, freeze or fawn kind of reaction, if they have an anger reaction, our response to that's very different, isn't it?
Oh, it
And
really is.
so they don't get the compassion so much. I mean, I'm generalizing here, of course, but I think
Mm,
as parents and teachers, that triggers us. If
mm,
if I'm faced with someone who's in fight mode, it's very difficult for me to go into nurture mode. You
mhm.
know what I mean? Like I'm kicked into fight mode as well, because I think, oh, I've got to be ready here. How
Yeah.
do how do we?
Yeah.
What kind of state of mind do we need to have as parents, teachers, tutors? Well, how do you do it? Because I imagine you have kids that you see that become aggressive, or, you see that play out in a session,
Mm.
what do you do in your mind? I can't imagine that you shout back at them and it turns into a fight.
No.
How do you manage that personally?
Well, I'm very
Well, I hope
conscious.
that's not what happens.
No, generally, no. No, I'm because I'm very aware of the fact that their nervous system's activated, and my nervous system is bigger than their nervous system. And so my sort of philosophy is be the calm, be the anchor in the situation, regulate myself, just literally, be the solid grounding force in the situation and just be really calm. And it's, you know, lower your voice. You don't have to be overly, um, effusive with kids in that state, but just that, simple reassurance of, what, it's okay. Let's just go for a walk. All good. You're not in trouble. I'm not going to let you hurt yourself. I'm not going to let you hurt anyone else. We need to remove ourselves from the situation. But the unspoken and spoken messages, you're okay. I'm okay. I've got this. We're going to, we're just going to calm down for a minute. And then unpacking afterwards with kids. The priority is always just to ensure everyone's safety and to get everybody's nervous system back within the window of tolerance, within a manageable range. So we're not in fight, flight, freeze, or flop. And then once we're there, having time there before you start the repair or the problem solving conversations. And for some kids, it needs to be the next day. For some kids,
Yeah.
we know their nervous system doesn't fully return to baseline for hours. And so you come back afterwards. And, my suggestion to parents and teachers is that if a child has had a sort of meltdown or explosion to that magnitude, they're probably not going to be learning much for the next few hours. They're probably not, even if they're in class and looking at the teacher, they're probably not really attending to what's going on. So can we give them time and space to just regulate and do something that they prefer? And, often what I hear is, oh, but that's just rewarding the behavior. We don't want to reward the behavior, which I understand, like that the behaviorist view was really pushed on all of us for a really long time. So it's ingrained in us to think like that. It's not. It's not nervous system informed. It's not trauma informed. It's not accurate in that situation. We're not rewarding the behavior. We're just giving them an opportunity to regulate and to come back to baseline. And then we do some sort of problem solving repair conversation afterwards.
Yeah. But that's seen as a reward. Is that what you're saying? That some people see that as rewarding the behavior because in return for the bad behavior, they get to have a nice little cozy sit and not have to do any work. And so the fear might be that's rewarding the behavior. And so then next time they'll deliberately throw
Do
over
that.
a desk or, have an outburst because they think, this is a good way for me to get some quiet
Yes.
time on my own.
Yeah, that's the thinking.
Why isn't it that? Why isn't? So how do we change our thinking? How have you changed your thinking so that isn't the case? Why isn't it?
So, well, I look at the role of the quiet space or the time engaging in a preferred activity or whatever the calming activity is after the blowout. I look at that as a tool for helping the child regulate. And I look at that also within a broader context of having a trauma-informed, nervous system aware environment sort of across the board. I think if you're operating in very compliance-based systems and kids are used to that, I'm going to be rewarded for things that they want me to do again, and I'm going to be punished for things that they don't want me to do again. And then, as a one-off, you change it and give them a reward after a meltdown, then, potentially some kids might exploit that. In the grand scheme of things, I don't think it's a big issue. There are the odd kids that, they've learned pretty quickly that if they don't want to be at school, they, tip over a table, mum will come and get me. There are certainly some kids who will, they won't be in a really heightened state of distress when they do that. It'll be a functional decision. There is no perfect situation, or there's certainly no realistic perfect situation when it comes to the education space. So we look at what's going to cause the least harm and have the most benefit. And I think allowing a child to regulate after a period of dysregulation, showing them that you have respect for them, showing them that you will support them, showing them that you understand that they need that time, and giving them that time and support, and then also coming back and saying, you know what happened wasn't okay. How can we stop that from happening again? I think we're building a relationship and building a trusting context that kids can operate within.
Yeah, I think that's really key what you said there is the second part of that. So if all you did was send the kid to a quiet space, let them calm down, they enjoy it, they come back, if that was the end of it, then that probably would be more likely to set up that kind of reward situation, wouldn't it? But what you're saying is, no, that's not the end of the story. That's just diffusing the immediate situation to stop it from escalating. But then there needs to be the follow-up, and there needs to be structures and systems put in place with the kid involved to try and stop that from happening again, or maybe get to the bottom of what caused it. Because like you say, it could have been the school bell or something triggering it.
Yes, and certainly once kids are old enough, involving them in that is key, because they're far more likely to engage in a support plan or a problem-solving process that they've participated in creating, and they've got some buy-in in. And even the kids who might, make the connection between their behaviour and the outcome that they want, and then start to use a behaviour functionally. My approach is always just to address it with them and go, I've noticed I'm school and tipping over a desk and then gets at home. So let's talk about that, and just kind of call them out on it and go, hey, we can't be doing that. Let's work out another plan. Let's have a different plan. If you why did you first tip over the desk? What do we need to do to support you? And working with the teacher and working with everyone around them to identify what sort of initially started that before they put together that behaviour could be functional and get them what they want.
Yeah, and perhaps, let's replace that with just a pass out to say, when I get to this point, it's okay, I can remove myself from the situation and go and calm down somewhere. I don't have to actually flip a desk to get that to happen, or hit somebody. Or
we want to teach those kids, that's life skills, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think we want to teach kids that really early.
Yeah. So we've been talking about anxiety for the most part, and really I'm kind of getting the impression that it is a little bit of an umbrella. We've been talking about top 5, but anxiety is kind of a symptom, isn't it, of difficulty. And so there are kids that become distressed or anxious because of the things we've talked about. And we want to make sure we kind of can identify those and come up with strategies for them that are out in the open, so that along the way we all learn from it. So rather than just kind of shut the behaviour down, or which, can lead to just masking those behaviours, so the student's sitting in the class and they look like they're having no problem because that's what we expect from them. And they know that it's expected that they'll be sitting there and looking and paying attention, but really they're not. Really inside they're in turmoil. And they're not listening, they're not learning. All of their effort is being applied to looking like they fit in and looking like they're compliant. So that's tricky. Sometimes that's tricky to spot, but we don't really want that, do we? We want to have a more open environment where a student feels okay about saying they're having a difficult time.
Yes. Yeah.
Rather than getting shut down.
Yes. Yeah. And I think it's a really simple, powerful thing teachers can do, and parents at home, but teachers certainly, is have some sort of emotional check-in or well-being check-in in the classroom that's just routinely available to kids. And it might be that the teacher, structures a quick check-in at one point during the day, and then kids know that they can use that check-in tool or process to communicate at other points throughout the day. Or it's really just, shining a light on the fact that well-being is important and how you feel matters, and you can communicate that, and I'm interested in that. That gives kids the freedom. And a lot of kids will mask anyway. A lot of kids will, and a lot of kids don't have a huge emotional vocabulary. And one of the benefits of having a check-in tool like that is that we build in kids' emotional vocabulary. And, a lot of the time kids will say they're okay, they're fine, unless there's something really not okay. And that's
Yeah.
what we want to pick up. Those are
Yeah.
the kids that we want to, that's where we're using, those are the kids we're using it for.
Yeah, my daughter's school had a weekly survey that was sent to every student, a weekly wellbeing survey that every student filled out. And it was just like, here's
Oh,
how I'm
good.
going this week. Well, I can't, I don't remember the exact questions, but every week the school checked in with them and they had an
Yeah.
opportunity to say, I'm not doing too well this week. And then someone would talk to them, not publicly. It was a chance for that. And then someone would make a time, they'd catch up. No one else would need to know. So
Oh,
I thought it was a really good system,
that's such a,
and so simple.
yes.
You
And
know,
is it a supportive school environment? Like, is it a private school or a
it
specialized
was a
school? Or,
private school. She's not there
yeah.
anymore. Yeah, it was a private school, Sacred Heart College.
Hmm.
So it's like a secondary, like it's a year 10 to 12 school,
Yeah. Yeah.
and like a caring, very much,
Mm.
a caring environment was what it was all about, but also
Yeah.
very high expectations as well. You can imagine that kind of private school, high
Mm.
expectation. We expect high performance, we expect good results, and so on. And mental health was, seen as an integral part of that.
Yeah.
And so,
Yeah.
you can't get that high performance and do well unless you have good mental health. And so every week was the mental health check-in. So it wasn't seen as a bad thing or a shameful thing. It was something everybody did.
Mm.
Well, it worked really well, from my
Oh, yeah.
perspective.
Yeah. And I think, certainly by that stage of negative development, young people need that because there is a lot of mental health stuff that emerges, pointy end of high school, adolescence, all of the social things that
Yeah.
change, starting work, they really do need that self-monitoring and someone to check in with them.
Yeah, it's very high pressure. And it leads me to the third thing on your list. And
Hmm.
so I know we've been talking for a while. We've only really talked about one and two, but I think that anxiety, as I've said, is like an overriding thing, isn't it? But number one, we had that whole emotional dysregulation, and really this is where the anxiety manifests, and we see difficult behaviours or distressing behaviours. We see the tip of the iceberg of the kid just not coping, not functioning, and the symptoms that go along with that. And it's our
Hmm.
job to try and get to the bottom of what might be causing that.
Mm.
And then, as we've talked about, that can escalate and lead to school avoidance, and the school can't, and, wanting to avoid those horrible situations and strategies and so on for dealing with that, which is about, creating the supportive environment, thinking about what might be triggering it. How can we build those transitions, as you said? I love that idea of taking something from your parents and keeping it with you for the
Mm.
day as that little kind of symbolic emotional connection, so you're not really separated. It's
Yeah.
brilliant. So I think getting clever about how we, you know, understanding what the causes are and then coming up with strategies for how we can overcome it, and involving the kid in that discussion if we can.
Mm.
Then number three on your list is social issues. And I think that's really interesting because as an educator, I tend to think everything is about education, because that's my focus. But for kids, it's often not. For kids, often education and academics are the least important thing in their life. And
Yeah.
the most important thing is social life. It's so sad. I had a kid sitting across from me not long ago who said, I don't have any friends. He
Yeah.
was really sad about it. And
Yeah.
that's
Yes.
how do you sit down and learn complex maths when actually you're sitting there thinking, I don't have any friends?
Oh,
So
I
those
know.
social issues are big, aren't they?
They are. They are. And that sense of belonging, I think schools can do a lot to create a sense of belonging at the school systems level. But if kids don't have that connection one to one with at least one peer, and one friend is enough for a lot of kids, if you've got one friend, you're okay. But if you've got no friends, it's a scary, daunting, very long day at
Yeah.
school. And then if you're being bullied or victimized in some way, it's, so much more complicated again.
Mm. And sometimes those behavior issues that we've been talking about, at number 1 and 2,
Mm.
feed into not having friends. Because if by luck your reaction to fight or flight is to fight, then chances are you might not be a good candidate for a friend. Other kids are scared of you, and so that
Yeah.
works against you. So
Yes.
this is the third most common thing you see kids for. And how do you approach that? I mean, how can we as adults help kids have friends? That's a really tricky one.
So I always look at the why. Why are they having difficulties forming and maintaining friendships? And for some kids, if they're autistic, we know that autistic kids get along better, or autistic humans of all ages get along better, generally speaking, with other autistic humans. And so it might be setting up some interest-based groups at school around shared interests or just an interest. We know that side-by-side interactions are easier for a lot of kids than face-to-face, regardless of neurotype. Having something that you gather together and do and focus your attention on collectively is easier than navigating one-to-one or group play.
Yeah, so if I build my Lego house and I'm sitting next to you and you're building your Lego house, that can be a happy space. But if we're building one together, then potentially goodbye friendship.
That's it. Or we've got to
That's
navigate
not where that goes.
game in the playground. And that's really tricky.
So I like that those side by side activities, because I think we don't often do those. I'm not sure that's on everybody's radar. I might be wrong. I don't work in schools, but what's your experience there, those side-by-side activities?
So I know some schools do it well. They'll have a, maker space, they'll call it, or something like that, where there'll be craft supplies available and there'll be a staff member there sort of just keeping an eye on things. But essentially kids can go and they have an activity to do if they don't have anyone to spend time with, and they have an opportunity to socialize with the other kids there, and it's in a really safe and supported environment because there is something that they're doing together. So and that makes a big difference. I know other schools have got a buddy bench, so a seat that you can go and sit on if you don't have anyone to play with, and then the other kids, if there is another child who doesn't have someone to play with, or just a group of kids who identify, hey, that person doesn't have anyone to play with, and then they will potentially approach, and that can be really supportive and helpful. It can also, unfortunately, for some kids be further isolating because they sit on the buddy bench alone. Nobody approaches them and it doesn't solve anything, but they're standing out now as the person who doesn't have a friend. So that can go either way.
And so the student I was mentioning just before, that said to me, doesn't have any friends. I said to him, have you got like a buddy bench or something at school? And he said, yeah, he sits on it, but nobody ever comes and talks to him. And so for him, that's even harder. And,
Worse.
Unfortunately, he said he also gets teased for sitting there. And so, yes, that's tricky, isn't it? Because now I'm admitting that I don't belong by sitting on that buddy bench. Whereas those side-by-side activities you mentioned are a little more, a little less, they require you not to out yourself so much, do they? Because you're just going and making something. Doing some Lego or some crafty stuff. Or what about computer things?
Oh, certainly there's lots of kids who love that, the schools that have some sort of tech room that's open during break time. It's always well utilized in my experience. And some kids will go there with other kids, but often it's kids who just prefer to be by themselves. I work with plenty of kids who they just need lunchtime to downregulate, and they don't necessarily want to be socializing. They don't want to feel like they're alone and standing out as being alone, but they don't actually want to be involved in a game or any sort of, intense social interaction. And so computer-based activities are great, or the library for some kids is their little safe haven at break time. So I think for schools to have a few options available, and I know some teachers are really lovely and they'll make their classroom available for a period during break time and let kids come and sit in there and draw or just sit, take some time out. And providing that safe space is really valuable for some kids. I know kids that just really appreciate that. And it's a low sensory environment often compared to the playground. This
Yeah,
playground's
that's screaming
yeah.
crazy.
Yeah,
Unpredictable playground.
that's right. So the classroom's a great alternative. And my observation is that often it comes down to resourcing schools. Teachers need to take breaks as well.
Yeah.
There isn't always someone available to monitor a space like that. But from a social and emotional well-being perspective, I think it's worthy of the allocation of funding, because those kids who are isolated and who have that that jolt of cortisol during the break because they're alone, lonely, what are people thinking, or they're getting teased, or they're sitting on their own at the buddy bench and feeling like they stand out, that impedes their learning. They don't go back to class ready to learn, feeling refreshed and well rested. They go back thinking, oh, thank God that's over, I can exhale, but they're not ready for learning. So
no, that to learn, you really need to be in a relaxed, attentive state. We know that a massive part of learning something is attention. The more attention you pay to something, the more likely it is you're to remember it. And so if you have divided attention, if a kid's sitting there and perhaps have low working memory or slow processing to begin with, and half their brain capacity is taken up with what just happened at recess time, or that they don't have any friends, then there's not a huge amount of attention left over to be listening to the teacher who might be presenting something quite complex. So you can see how it's just not a good formula, is it? You want to have kids in the class that are paying attention, because attention is absolutely essential
it is.
to remember and learn something.
Yeah, it really is. And there's the additional layer of kids have been teased or bullied or actively excluded, that then we know that their attention, we can guarantee that they're not attending because they're going to have been in a fight, flight, freeze, fawn, or flop state because they're being victimized. And we know that it takes a long time to come back from that. So for schools to have a process in place for those kids of something really structured, if you're having this difficulty, this is where you go, this is what we do about it, and that is followed consistently, is really important.
I love the way, I love the idea of having a structure around something like that. I mean, I don't want to sound like I'm being negative about the buddy bench or the friendship bench, because I've also seen it work. I suppose it's how you do it, isn't it? And maybe it's monitored. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Maybe there's a teacher there as well, or,
Yes.
But it is, for me, all of this is about how do you, of course it's about the students' well-being, but if we're trying to teach them, we have to have their attention, don't we? And if all of these things are getting in the way, and like I said, this is number three on your list of issues that kids face. And so this is a really big one, isn't it? And I think it's probably something that affects everyone at some stage.
Yes. Yeah, we're inherently social creatures. We need to feel like we belong as part of a community and that we're safe. And there's a lot of environments throughout our life where that's not how we experience them. Workplaces, we know workplaces for a lot of people are a source of stress, exclusion. Moral injury has been added to the DSM recently as a as a sort of supplemental description for what's happening. But the idea that there's institutional lack of safety, whether it's bullying or lack of some sort of injustice built in within the organisation. So yeah, it's certainly not just kids that experience this.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, so number 3 is social issues, big issue. Number 4, again, not necessarily education related, but a huge impact on education is family stress. And a lot of kids go through this, don't they? From parents separating, or even just parents fighting and tension at home, or even like moving house, or, kind of big changes like that in the family environment can have a massive impact on kids and their education. And if they're living with learning difficulty on top of that, you know, it's even a bigger impact, because I'm already kind of living close to the edge,
Yeah,
trying to
and it
keep up,
might tip
let
you
alone,
over.
yeah, that's
Yes.
right. And so
Yes.
they're difficult, aren't they? How do we deal with those kind of things? So let's say, I mean, I know I went through this as a parent, of shifting house,
Hmm.
shifting to a new school, new suburb. And that was a really difficult decision for us because we knew it would have a big impact on the kids, and it did. They
Mm,
hated us for it because they lost their friends. You know what I mean? They were like, "You've
yes.
destroyed," that kind of dramatic
You've ruined my
childhood. You've
life.
destroyed my life.
Yes. Yeah.
uh,
Well, it is big for kids.
yeah, it is. It is, and
Yeah.
I'm not saying that to belittle them, saying you've destroyed my life. That's how big it was for them. That's how they felt.
Mm.
Um, it's easy as adults to underestimate the impact that those kind of home environments have. So, how do we deal with that? How do we help kids through those big transitions, so that they can come to school and learn?
Mm. Family stress is so common, and it's really, it's an overused cliche, but there's truth in the saying that you have to put the oxygen mask on yourself first. So when parents are able to regulate and able to manage their own stress, kids will weather stressful situations more easily or better.
Yeah,
So for parents to have as much support around them as they possibly can, acknowledging that sometimes there's just not support out there. It's life is hard. And
yeah,
something like moving house, we know that that's, in the top three life stresses, I think it is. Second to death or third to death and divorce.
yeah,
So it is a stressful situation. And the best that you can do in those situations is to create, I call it creating little rhythms, or lean into the routine, to have little things that are predictable, that are the same all the time. So when you're moving house, having the box of things that you know that you're going to need at bedtime and at breakfast time, and making sure that you have as much as possible the same routine. Routine is really regulating for all of us.
yep,
Having time that you just connect with each other, whether it's that you go out and just, even if you just get Macca's and eat in the park or something, where you just sit down and go, okay, we're just taking this time to enjoy a meal, check in, co-regulate, have a game of whatever, and then get back to the stressful situation. And talking to kids as well. A lot of the time, we as parents, we're so in our head and just trying to get everything done that we don't explain to our kids what's happening.
mm,
And that uncertainty is part of what is stressful for them. So for them to know that, okay, well, for example, we're moving house, this is what it's going to look like. We'll do this on this day. Pack your little bag of things that you'll always have with you. And this is our schedule. And we'll be unpacked and ready by this time. And creating whatever predictability around it you can. And the same if there is a separation and divorce. It's hugely emotional for everyone. And kids don't know that, kids are naturally egocentric up to a certain age. They think it's their fault. They think
yeah,
it's all about them. And explaining to them that that's not the case, that this is, mum and dad, for whatever reason, we're still a family. We'll always be a family. Our family's going to look different. This is not anything to do with you. We love you. It's going to be okay. You're still going to see both of us. You're going to have a bedroom with, you're still going to have your favorite toys, and just the little stuff that parents don't realize is so important to kids, reassuring them that I know this is important to you, and this is what it's going to look like, can go a really long way to helping them cope with what is inherently just going to be a stressful situation.
yeah. A divorce is also incredibly stressful for the parents. And so,
Mm.
your comment before about put your oxygen mask on first, because you really have to, I think consciously, if I understand what you're saying, consciously you need to try to separate your personal anxiety from your
Mm.
conversation with your kids. One of the things you mentioned before was that a lot of kids are naturally anxious because they've grown up in an anxious environment, and so their system is kind of set at a certain level subconsciously, even just by the environment that they've grown up in. And so if, even though, like a duck, your feet might be scrabbling crazy underwater, trying to have that calm approach when talking to the kids about it, and that reassuring, like you say, having the routine, trying to keep things steady and normal is what I hear you saying is helpful for kids in those situations.
Yeah, and as much as possible, normalizing all the emotions that go with it, because parents in a situation of separation or divorce are probably going to be upset, and kids are going to pick up on that. So being able to name that, and also name that it's okay for them to be upset, and that you understand that they might be sad or angry or worried, and that you're sad and worried too, but we're going to be okay. We've got a plan. You're loved. We are still, a family. Our family looks different. You're going to see both parents, and this is what we can say for sure. And so making space for both. Difficult emotions are going to be there, and that's okay. And we're going to look after you in this way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, really tricky. I mean, I remember my kids getting upset because their friends' parents were divorcing, so it even had a knock-on effect, where their friend was so anxious about it, it made my kids anxious, so it's a really big thing, isn't it? And
it is.
And kids are scared of that because it's so common. Unfortunately, I imagine kids, many kids would have a kind of a base level of, what if my parents split up? What would I do? Would I be okay?
Yes. Yeah. And, all kids have a friend who's living between two houses, and the stresses that come with that is, kids talk about that kind of stuff. So being able to have a conversation with your own kids about what it will look like for them, so that they don't go to that scenario of what they've heard from, Billy at school or what have you. I think, talking to your kids is one of the best things, thinking about what you're going to say ahead of time, being as regulated as you can at the time, and keeping them involved in a developmentally appropriate way, so that they don't feel alone and scared and uncertain about it is really important.
Yeah, I love that idea you were talking about of keeping some routines in place, so that it's not everything that changes, but there are some things that stay the same, some routines that stay the same, and there is some time out, to go and have a nice time in the midst of all of that.
Yes.
So tricky, isn't it? I mean, these kids are coming to school with, many of them, so much on their plate already. This is before we're asking them to now, solve for X in maths.
Not important for them at this point. The relationship with the teachers can be a really good source of support, and recognizing that they'll have plenty more years of education to solve for X.
Yeah.
But during those really tricky periods, school can be a safe place, and a teacher that's with them 6 hours a day, 5 days a week, can be that safe person the teacher can be an anchor. I know it's a lot to put on teachers, but I think teachers are that, whether they know it or not.
Yeah,
because
they are. They're amazing.
Yeah.
Yes. And look, we've been talking about this from quite a, deficit kind of negative perspective, but, it's also true that doing maths or literacy or going to school could be a great distraction if it's something that you enjoy. So it's not to say that if you're stressed and anxious, therefore you hate school, or therefore school's a bad place, because if your classroom environment or your learning environment is positive and supportive and you're achieving success, then that's actually going to be beneficial. That could be something that you actually love and look forward to, as many kids do. I think we just kind of, because we've started off, because this kind of focus of this has been difficulties and problems, you know what I mean? It tends to be negative, but I don't want people to think that, we're saying school's a bad place for kids. It can be a
No,
salvation for them in the midst of this.
for sure. It can be a safe space, and it is for lots of kids, and it's where they get to just see friends and not worry. If there is a lot of complexity at home, it can be the place where they go and they just don't have to think about that stuff. And for the kids who love learning, which, I hope that there are lots of kids who love learning. I certainly loved learning as a child, and I hope that the curriculum and the weight of education still makes space for kids to love learning.
Yeah.
I like to think it
Look,
does.
I don't think I've ever met a kid that doesn't love learning,
Mm.
but they dislike not learning. You know what I mean? Unfortunately, many of them, that I work with will sit through a class and not learn anything, and that's when they don't like it. If
Mm.
they're achieving success, whatever level that success is, they love it. Every
Yeah.
kid. Like, I've never met a kid that says, I don't like to learn.
Yes.
They might not like school or the environment, or it might be too hard or too fast or too confusing, but that's not about learning. So for me, it's about finding that sweet spot of, I'm challenging you enough, but not too much. Because
Mm.
if it's too easy, then they're also not going to feel like they're learning anything and they'll be bored. But that's the kind of art of it, I think, is to have that
Mm.
kind of sweet spot of, yes, this is difficult, but look, you did it. I think
Yeah.
that's where learning is enjoyable, because you
Yeah.
finish a lesson and you go, hey, I'm better now than I was an hour ago.
Yeah.
That's it's
Efficacy.
yeah. So,
Yeah.
kids love learning,
Mm.
but like all of
Yeah.
us, they hate it when they're not learning, so that's, yeah, so school can be, and for many kids is, an amazing place and a safe haven, which reminds me of our last conversation, which people should go back and listen to, about how
Mm.
do we create those safe spaces and those nurturing environments in schools so that
Mm.
schools can be a safe place to go. Yeah, I wanted to say that because I didn't want to give the impression that, school is a bad thing. It's a fantastic thing,
It is. I
and if
agree.
we get it right, it's absolutely brilliant and life-changing and,
Yes.
all the things that we know schooling is. It's just that we've been focusing here on the kind of pointy end of kids that, are struggling.
Yeah, and they're the kids that I think we really need to focus on, that whole idea of, margins for the centre, when we support the kids that need extra support, whether it's through social and emotional wellbeing, initiatives, or universal design, or any of the supports that help the kids who are on the fringe. It lifts everybody. It helps all the kids. So focusing on those kids as much as, yeah, I hadn't thought about it, but it does sound negative in our conversation. But it will help everyone. They really need it, but everyone will benefit.
Yeah,
And creating safe, psychologically safe school communities at every level will benefit staff and the community as
yeah,
a whole, because there's a lot of we know teachers are burning out. There's an issue
yeah,
in the profession, and psychological safety has a role to play for teachers just as much as it does for kids.
absolutely. And,
More so because they set the tone.
yeah, 100%. And, as just like kids love to learn, as a teacher, I love for them to learn. That's what I do it
Mm,
for. If the kid's
yeah,
not learning, I'm very dissatisfied as well.
of course. We all need
Yeah,
self-efficacy.
it's about getting success, and I think even though we've been, you know, kind of talking about difficulties today, ultimately it's all about how do we achieve success.
Mm,
In perhaps what seem to be cases where it feels like you're not going to achieve success. Students where you go, oh my gosh, what are we going to do here? This, you kind of
mm,
feel out of ideas and, like you're not sure where to go. Um, there's always a solution. You know what
yes.
I mean? That it's a matter of persevering and having a process and a structure in place that allows us to come to a solution for that.
I was going to say something that might be of interest to your listeners. If they've done from the last podcast, there was a webinar called the Behaviour Response Blueprint. So I've since put together a custom GPT. You can just use it with a free Chat GPT account, and it does help come up with solutions. It's a thinking companion.
Wow, that sounds
Works through the
amazing.
framework,
Yeah.
and it gives people, I've loaded it with a specific series of prompts to guide people through, and then a whole lot of my research and evidence-based, neuroaffirming, really practical guidance around UDL and looking at behavior through a nervous system lens, and
What's UDL? Sorry.
universal design for
Oh yeah,
learning. So
yes. I'm really bad with acronyms.
yeah, sorry, I am
Because I
too.
wasn't listening to the rest of the things you were saying. Saying UDL, what's UDL?
No, sorry. Yeah, no,
No, that's
universal.
all right.
So really just those strategies that teachers can use in the classroom to capture all the different ways kids learn and communicate what they have learned. And a whole lot of autism specific and ADHD specific research. And it helps people think things through because, like you said, we just have to kind of sit and think about it. What could be going on here, and what are the possible solutions? And, we're all stretched for time, and
Yeah,
cognitive load we know is a huge barrier for kids learning, but also for teachers and for
yeah,
clinicians. We're all overloaded. So the idea is to use AI. I think it's got enormous potential. So yeah, it's a free GPT that people can use it's not diagnostic. It's a thinking partner. It's a
wow,
brainstorming partner, and it comes up with evidence-based, things that align with the neuroaffirming, trauma-informed, psychological safety-based approach to supporting kids. So
wow. That sounds
send
fantastic.
that to you, and then people want to
Yeah,
use it.
we'll put a link in to the show notes to that. Now, the last thing on your list
Mm.
is number 5. So we've had emotional behavioural dysregulation, those tricky
Mm.
behaviours that we see that are either triggered by, difficulties that are identifiable, or they might be sensory and just kind of reactive environmental triggers to those difficult behaviours and how we deal with those. We've got anxiety as kind of an overarching thing, but then it can lead to those avoidance strategies.
Mm.
And that's something we want to work, towards not, stopping that, breaking that cycle of avoidance, because that increases the anxiety and, kind of feeds itself. We've talked
Mm-hmm.
about social issues, big ones for kids, making friends, keeping friends. Who am I in this world? What does it
Mm-hmm.
mean to live with dyslexia or dyscalculia? What does that make me as a person? What
Mm.
is a person that lives with autism in this world? They're really big questions for kids to grapple with on top of just life and growing up and,
Yep.
those social issues, huge, massive things for kids to deal with. We've got big family stresses, was the one we spoke about, where I suppose kids are out of control, feel out of control in those situations, don't they? They are just along for the ride for those big decisions, which makes it even more difficult and stressful
Yeah.
to cope with because I don't get a decision on which house I'm moving to or whether my parents divorce or not. So they're the 4 things we've talked about so far. On my quick summary,
Mm-hmm.
do I miss anything there?
No, that was thorough.
And then the last one is people wanting a second opinion on the
Mm.
diagnosis.
Mm.
Can you tell me what that's about? So this is kind of the 5th most common thing that people see you for, which surprised me.
Yeah.
Yeah, why is that? What
Yeah.
happens there?
So, well, some of that might be, I don't know that it would be the same for all psychologists. So certainly my area of interest is around, neurodiversity broadly, and that includes learning difficulties. Autism and ADHD tends to be the majority of the population, but we know that comes along with a whole lot of co-occurrences. And so often families will come and they'll have had a diagnostic assessment and they'll have received a diagnosis and they don't feel that it's the right fit, or they don't feel like it explains everything.
Yeah,
And so they'll come and say, can we look at this again? And so the child might have received a diagnosis of a learning difficulty or of ADHD or of OCD, things like that. And parents will come and say, I think my child's autistic. I've been reading. I think they're autistic. Can you review this?
yeah,
And because my area of interest is the internalized presentation of autism, which is often not well detected with standardized tools. A lot of the tools that we have available to us are designed and normed on white boys, white
Mm-hmm.
males, and they're not good at picking up, and they look at more classic externalized features of autism. They're not good at picking up autism that's internalized or in kids that mask or that female or different cultural backgrounds. And so
And kind of the stereotype of autism as well, that if you're not informed about autism, then, it would be easy to think someone doesn't fit that profile because they're not kind of stereotypically, autistic in their behavior.
Yes, and it's not just sort of in the general population that we see that. We see that even among health professionals who haven't kept up with the research, that are still looking at autism through quite a narrow lens, where we've had so much more information available to us. But if we're not continually keeping up with that and continually upskilling, it's easy to go, well, they make eye contact, they've got friends, they're not autistic, there's something else going on. Whereas we know that by no means does that rule out autism, having friends and making eye contact. So yeah, and it is also a case of often the squeakiest wheel gets the oil. So if we've got a child that goes for an assessment and they're very clearly dyslexic, that will be the diagnosis that they come out with, and potentially people don't look beyond that.
Yeah.
And consider what's happening socially or the other factors that might be at play. So yeah, and that is something that parents know. That I always say to parents, you're the expert in your child. You've been with them from day one. You are best placed to know. And I push back on this idea that parents, seek diagnoses that aren't accurate, or that it's a parenting issue. Sometimes parents have a parenting style that hasn't been helpful, but a lot of what's going on for kids gets blamed on parents, and it misses really valuable information. And so having someone go through and do a really comprehensive assessment is really important to make sure that you have all of the information, because as a psychologist, if someone comes and you have one session with a parent and one session with a child, you can draw conclusions from that, but they might not be right.
Yeah.
And often not. What looks like one thing at surface level, when you dig beneath and get a whole lot of information from a whole lot of people, is often something different.
Yeah. Is it important to have an identification, that someone lives with autism or dyslexia or dyscalculia, if they're getting the support they need? Does it really matter to have that piece of paper? What's your view on that? Is it important to get that identification complete?
Well, from my perspective, yes. And I'm a little bit conflicted in the sense that I, very much identify as an affirming practitioner who works through the social model of disability. And so that pathologizing lens of a diagnosis is very medical model. However, it's really important because diagnosis informs treatment or therapy or supports. And so, when you say, is it important if someone has right supports and everything's going well and they're fine? Well, no, it's not, because we don't need to change anything. But people don't come for a diagnostic assessment often. We're seeing a lot more adults who are coming for diagnostic assessment for self-understanding, and that helps them piece together like their early life experiences. That's, often different in that as adults we can sort of craft a life for ourselves where we're supported.
Yeah.
And you find that a lot of, undiagnosed adults will have created a life that just works for them. And so they're okay now, but if you took them out of that life and put them into something that was not right for them, then we would see things become a lot more challenging. But for kids that present, or that for parents who come to a psychologist or a clinician for a diagnostic assessment, there's usually something going on and they need help. And once we identify what's going on, then we know what's going to be most helpful.
Yeah.
So, and having the full picture is really important. If we've got a child that's dyslexic, absolutely identifying that and getting that early intervention and the right supports at school is going to remove a big layer of stress for them. If there is also, autism or something else happening that we don't identify, then we haven't holistically addressed everything that's going on.
Yeah.
So yeah, I do. And kids get to a point where we talk to them about their diagnosis and how their brain works and what that means for them and what their strengths are and where they might need support and how do we get that support. And that's important for them understanding themselves and then being able to self-advocate.
Mm. Yeah, I think from the perspective of the kid, my experience is that kids that have not had an identification like that kind of default to I'm stupid or
Mm,
I'm a bad person or there's something wrong with me or I'm
yeah.
hopeless because they can see that they're struggling. They know they're struggling and they see the other kids around them, kind of sailing through and think, what's wrong with me? I must be stupid. And so I think
Yes.
from my perspective, that identification, even though, yes, I agree with you, it is that kind of medical model, pathologizing,
Mm,
differences. But at the same time, if we don't see it as a negative, but just as an identification and
mm,
go, okay, well, actually, here's the reason why
mm,
you're finding this difficult. And the reason isn't the label. If we're talking about dyslexia, usually the reason is you find it really difficult to hear and process speech sounds.
mhm.
So when I say bench, you might be hearing vench or, something different, and you can't pull those sounds apart in your head and,
Yes.
manipulate them and then spit them out the other end. So that's what makes reading so hard. Yes, we have a label of dyslexia for it, but actually being able to get down to the nitty gritty with a kid and say, here's why you find it difficult. And that's why we're doing this. That's why these are the exercises that we're doing. This is what we're working on because that's
Yes.
going to help you. That's a very different picture for a kid than I'm dumb.
Oh, it is. And lots of kids exhale when they realize, okay, this has a name, people understand this, and I'm not the only one. There's a real exhale. It's because it's no longer, oh, I'm just out of my depth and not keeping up. It's
Yeah.
now, okay, I can work with this.
Yep.
So
Yeah,
I
that's right. And you just kind of did a fist a fist pump there because that's right. It becomes a challenge, doesn't it? It
think,
becomes something that can become a positive. I imagine with autism, it's a similar thing. It's about what are the strategies we can come up with.
yeah, and I'm normalizing it for kids that, that I don't know if you're familiar with the double empathy problem. The idea, well, I think I mentioned it before. There's research. So Damien Milton has a theory, and there's a lot of work around it now. The double empathy problem is this idea that there's a neurotypical communication and a autistic communication style. And if you have an autistic communication style, you might have trouble in your social interactions with neurotypical people, but have greater ease in your interactions with other autistic people. And so for kids to understand that, the reason you're having a hard time socially is because you're kind of speaking a little bit of a different language.
Mm,
And there's nothing wrong with your language and there's nothing wrong with their language, but you kind of need to know how each other communicate and find ways to meet in the middle and understand each other
yes,
so that breakdown doesn't keep happening. And for kids, that can be really like, oh, I'm not broken. I'm just, I'm
that's
just
right.
wired. I just communicate differently. It's
I love that
explanation.
positive language. So it's, like you say, the medical model says autism, is a, whatever it says, lack of
Yeah,
social
yeah,
skills,
yeah.
deficit, deficit, deficit. You can't make friends. It's the way you put it is very different. It's more like a
Mm.
positive thing to say, no, it's not that you're bad at it.
Yeah, and talking to kids about the social model of disability as as a concept, not necessarily explaining the model, but the idea that, that there are things that will help you navigate the neurotypical world more easily. For example, you might not catch sarcasm and those, that kind of the metaphors and things like that, but you can say to people, "Hey, I didn't know what you meant. I don't know what you meant by that. I don't, I'm not good with sarcasm. I do it all the time. I'm not good with
Yeah,
sarcasm. If you use sarcasm, I'm probably going to miss it 99% of the time, but you know that now. So if I
yeah.
look at you blankly, you've been sarcastic, you'll know why." And it's a matter of just owning the areas where you're different or have difficulty, and then finding ways to ensure that you have a bridge or supports or
Mm.
access to the things that you need to make life manageable.
When you have done these second opinions, And it has turned out, say, a kid is living with autism that has not been seen before. Generally, what's the outcome of that? Is it a positive outcome?
Certainly for the parents who sought the second opinion, to have that validation is almost always positive. There's always, it's, for parents, there's always mixed emotions because it's an acknowledgement that your child is going to have some challenges. That's the reality of it. It's not a neuro-affirming world that we live in. There are certainly going to be barriers that your child's going to be. No parent wants that for their child. However, it's also validating for them to go, you know what, you're not crazy. What you saw was correct, and then these are the things that we can do to support you and your child. And it might not be that school changes much about what they're doing, but you can understand what's really going on for your child. You can communicate that to them. Even them just having more understanding about what's going on for your child can make a difference to that child's quality of interaction and the way their day rolls out. And in time for the child to understand themselves, depending on their age, maybe it's immediate or maybe it's that you have the conversation later, is really important. Because as you said, you do have, there's more scope for self-compassion when you understand that there's a reason for your struggles. I had the same thing. I'm self-identified autistic. I haven't sought an assessment because I don't see the need for me personally, but it was certainly a process of sort of reflecting on a whole lot of things in my life and just having a lot more compassion for it, where I'd previously been really self-critical and gone, God,
why can't you do that, you idiot?
Yeah. Okay, well, now I know why I do that. So I can have a little bit more compassion.
Yeah, yes.
And it's important for all of us.
That's right.
And,
having that, I can only imagine what it's like having that at a young age. But, then, I'm just talking about myself now, but, as an adult being late identified as even just living with dyslexia, if only I'd known when I was younger, because, then I had to undo 40 years of being hard on myself. It's much harder to undo 40 years of thinking I'm an idiot than it would be.
Truly ingrained. Yeah.
And so, I think the earlier the better. And yes, it's difficult. Sometimes, it was like difficult news to hear, perhaps, as you described, because you kind of go, oh, okay, this means difficulty, doesn't it, in the world we live in. But I kind of think it's better to know that up front and then have a plan and a strategy and work your way through it than to struggle and not know why. From the kids' perspective. Forget about supports and services and funding and what can the school do for me and so on. Just from the kids' own perspective, we were talking about social issues and, that whole self-identity, as the third thing on your list, as the most common thing. So, from that perspective, having an identification for a kid helps them work through why they find it so difficult and gives them a chance to frame it positively for themselves.
It does. And for parents, that can make a huge difference. Even the little things that parents find really frustrating at times, why does it take so long to get from A to B with our kid? Or why do we keep running into this same issue all the time? Why is that? And it'll often be something simple like, okay, well, now we know they're autistic. Now we know that transitions are hard for them. We need to put these few steps in place around each transition, and transitions will be easier. For a family's functioning and quality of life, those little things can make a world of difference. If you're used to having, bedtime battles every night, or, every morning trying to get out the door is a nightmare, having some strategies just to ease that burden can be life-changing. Yes. Regardless of what the NDIS or school give you. Just
exactly.
All the tools in your toolkit. You just go, oh God, we're not all crying by the time we get in the car. We're winning,
I know. It comes down to that, doesn't it?
Yeah.
If you can have a smooth day and you get home and everyone's happy and, there hasn't been a meltdown or something smashed or, a crisis, unfortunately, that can happen, can't it? It's life. Mm-hmm. Certainly my experience, in a house of neurodivergent kids and father, it's challenging, you know.
Yeah. Yes.
Um,
Yeah. And understanding is so valuable when you understand why it's challenging and you understand that you can predict what's going to be difficult and understand why that, takes so much of the frustration out of things, doesn't it?
yeah.
I don't know if you're familiar with Circle of Security parenting program, but there's this saying that, as parents or as adults, we need to be bigger, stronger, wiser, and kind. And it's, at face value, really logical. But that diagnostic piece, understanding what's going on, that's part of the wiser. That's part of it. That's where the wisdom comes from, of going, yeah, I can be wiser in what I know, but unless I know what's happening for my child, it's really hard to be that kind of wise. So
Yeah.
once you've got that information, you can do the bigger, stronger, wiser, and kind part.
Yeah.
Without it, your nervous system just goes off the Richter with your child's often.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
You're bigger, stronger, and you're trying to just, sort of outshout them, or it very easily gets out of hand.
Well, Valli, thank you so much once again. Absolutely brilliant. So
Lovely.
helpful. You're full of such great information, and I love your positive, affirming, supportive attitude, because I really think that's what, kids that really struggle need, that solid rock, don't they? They need that foundation of structure and predictability so that they can, calm down themselves and start to feel like, okay, maybe it's going to be okay.
Mm-hmm.
It is unfortunate, as we said at the start, that often learning difficulties go hand in hand with mental health issues, but it's easy to see why. It's because, school is hard enough, isn't it? School's hard for kids that do well at school, still get stressed and find it difficult. So, if you're really struggling, it's extra difficult. So I think, building that supportive environment is fantastic. I want to remind people again of that previous episode we did and your Safe House framework, and for people to check out your new tool that you've built, which sounds brilliant. And we'll put I'll put that in the show notes, put a link in there. Anything else before we finish off? Do you think is anything we haven't covered or anything else?
We covered a lot of ground. Thank you so much for having me. It's always really lovely to talk to you. I appreciate your time.
My pleasure. And thank you everyone for listening. I hope it's been helpful. I really do love it when people reach out and make suggestions. In fact, this episode came from a suggestion from one of our listeners, reached out and said they wanted some information about, mental health and supporting students and supporting parents. So hopefully this has answered those questions. And look, genuinely, I just think you're amazing, Valli, and so helpful and brilliant. Thank you very much for giving us your time and your expertise.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
No worries. And thanks again for listening. You can find us on Facebook under Discastia at discastia.com. You could subscribe to our newsletter to get updates when I release episodes, which I'm trying to be more consistent with now. So thanks again, everyone. Thank you, Valli. Hopefully see you next time.
See you later.